Hello, fifth grade readers. Welcome to another episode of Reader's Workshop. We're going to start today with our read aloud, which is The Thief of Always by Clive Barker, and I'm going to read 2 chapters today. The first chapter we're going to read is chapter 3, which is called Pleasure and the Worm, and this is the image. What a fine thing it would be, Harvey thought, to build a place like this, to drive its foundations deep into the earth, to lay its floor and hoist its walls, to say, where there was nothing I raised a house. That would be a very fine thing. It wasn't a puffed up peacock of a place either. There were no marble steps, no fluted columns. It was a proud house. Certainly but there was nothing wrong with that. It had much to be proud of. It stood 4 stories high and boasted more windows than Harvey could readily count. Its porch was wide, as were the steps that led up to its carved front door. Its slated roofs were steep and crowned with magnificent chimneys and lightning rods. Its highest point, however, was neither a chimney nor a lightning rod, but a large and elaborately wrought weather vane, which Harvey was peering up at when he heard the front door open and a voice say, "Harvey Swick, as I live and breathe." He looked down, the weather vane's white silhouette still behind his eyes, and there on the porch stood a woman who made his grandmother, the oldest person he knew, look young. She had a face like a rolled-up ball of cobwebs, from which her hair, which could have been spider's work, fell in wispy abundance. Her eyes were tiny, her mouth tight, her hands gnarled. Her voice, however, was melodious, and its words welcoming. "I thought maybe you'd decided not to come," she said, picking up a basket of freshly cut flowers that she'd left on the step, "which would have been a pity. Come on in. There's food on the table. You must be famished." "I can't stay long," Harvey said. "You must do whatever you wish," came the reply. "I'm Mrs. Griffin, by the way." "Yes, Rictus mentioned you. I hope he didn't bend your ear too much. He loves the sound of his own voice. That and his reflection." Harvey had climbed the porch steps by now and stopped in front of the open door. This was a moment of decision. He knew, though he wasn't quite certain why. "Step inside," Mrs. Griffin said, brushing a spider hair back from her furrowed brow. But Harvey still hesitated, and he might have turned around and never stepped inside that house, except that he heard a boy's voice yelling, "I gotcha! I gotcha!" followed by uproarious laughter. "Wendell!" Mrs. Griffin said. "Are you chasing the cats again?" The sound of laughter grew even louder, and it was so full of good humor that Harvey stepped over the threshold and into the house just so that he could see the face of its owner. He only got a brief look. A goofy, bespectacled face appeared for a moment at the other end of the hallway. Then a piebald cat dashed between the boy's legs, and he was off after it, yelling and laughing again. "He's such a crazy boy," Mrs. Griffin said, "but all the cats love him." The house was more wonderful inside than out. Even on the short journey to the kitchen, Harvey glimpsed enough to know that this was a place built for games, chases, and adventures. It was a maze in which no 2 doors were alike. It was a treasure house where some notorious pirate had hidden his blood-stained booty. It was a resting place for carpets flown by djinns and boxes sealed before the flood, where the eggs of beasts that the earth had lost were wrapped and waiting for the sun's heat to hatch them. "It's perfect," Harvey murmured to himself. Mrs. Griffin caught his words. "Nothing's perfect," she replied. "Why not?" "Because time passes," she went on, staring down at the flowers she'd cut, "and the beetle and the worm find their way into everything sooner or later." Hearing this, Harvey wondered what grief it was Mrs. Griffin had known or seen to make her so mournful. "I'm sorry," she said, covering her melancholy with a tiny smile. "You didn't come here to listen to my dirges. You came here to enjoy yourself, didn't you?" "I guess I did," Harvey said. "So let me tempt you with some treats." Harvey sat himself down at the kitchen table, and within 60 seconds Mrs. Griffin had set a dozen plates of food in front of him: hamburgers, hot dogs, and fried chicken, Mounds of buttered potatoes, apple, cherry, and mud pies, ice cream and whipped cream, grapes, tangerine, and a plate of fruits he couldn't even name. He set to eating with gusto, and he was devouring his second slice of pie when a freckled girl with long frizzy blonde hair and huge blue-green eyes ambled in. "You must be Harvey," she said. "How did you know?" "Wendell told me." "How did he know?" She shrugged. "He just heard. I'm Lulu, by the way." "Did you just arrive?" "No, I've been here for ages. Longer than Wendell, but not as long as Mrs. Griffin. Nobody's been here as long as she. Isn't that right?" "Almost," said Mrs. Griffin, a little mysteriously. "Do you want something to eat, sweetie?" Lulu shook her head. "No, thanks. I haven't got much of an appetite at the moment." She nevertheless sat down opposite Harvey, stuck her thumb in the mud pie, and licked it clean. "Who invited you here?" she asked. "A guy named Rictus? Oh, yeah, the one with the grin? That's him. He's got a sister and two brothers," she went on. "You've met them then?" "Not all of them," Lulu admitted. "They keep themselves to themselves, but you'll meet one or two of them sooner or later." I I don't think I'll be staying," Harvey said. "I mean, my mom and dad don't even know I'm here." "Sure they do," Lulu replied. "They just didn't tell you about it." This confused Harvey, and he said so. "Call your mom and dad," Lulu suggested. "Ask him." "Can I do that?" he wondered. "Of course you can," Mrs. Griffin replied. "The phone's in the hallway." Carrying a spoonful of ice cream with him, Harvey went to the phone and dialed. At first there was a whining sound on the line, as though a wind were in the wires. Then as it cleared, he heard his mom say, "Who is this?" "Before you start yelling," he began. "Oh, honey," his mom cooed. "Did you arrive?" "Arrive? You are at the holiday house, I hope." "Yes, I am, but—" "Oh, good. I was worried maybe you'd lost your way. Do you like it there?" You knew I was coming?" Harvey said, catching Lulu's eye. "I told you," she mouthed. "Of course we knew," his mom went on. "We invited Mr. Richter to show you the place. You look so sad, you poor lamb. We thought you needed a little fun." "Really?" said Harvey, astonished at this turn of events. "We just want you to enjoy yourself," his mom went on. "So you just stay as long as you want." "What about school?" he said. "You deserve a little time off," came the reply. "Don't you worry about anything. Just have a good time." I will, Mom. Bye, honey. Bye." Harvey came away from that conversation shaking his head in amazement. "You were right," he said to Lulu. "They arranged everything." "So now you don't have to feel guilty," said Lulu. "Well, I guess I'll see you around later, huh?" And with that, she ambled away. "If you're finished eating," Mrs. Griffin said, "I'll show you to your room." "I'd like that." She duly led Harvey up the stairs. At the landing, basking on the sun-drenched windowsill, was a cat with fur the color of the cloudless sky. "That's Blue Cat," Mrs. Griffin said. "You saw Stew Cat playing with Wendell. I don't know where Clue Cat is, but he'll find you. He likes new guests." "Do you have a lot of people coming here?" "Only children, very special children, like you and Lulu and Wendell. Mr. Hood wouldn't have just anybody." "Who's Mr. Hood?" "The man who built the holiday house," Mrs. Griffin replied. "Will I meet him too?" Mrs. Griffin looked discomfited by the question. "Maybe," she said, her gaze averted, "but he's a very private man." They were up on the landing now, and Mrs. Griffin led Harvey past a row of painted portraits to a room at the back of the house. It overlooked an orchard, and the warm air carried the smell of ripe apples into the room. "You look tired, my sweet," Mrs. Griffin said. "Maybe you should lie down for a little while." Harvey usually hated to sleep in the afternoon. It reminded him too much of having the flu or the measles. But the pillow looked very cool and comfortable, and when Mrs. Griffin had taken her leave, he decided to lie down just for a few minutes. Either he was more tired than he thought, or the calm and comfort of the house rocked him into a slumber. Whichever, his eyes closed almost as soon as he put his head on the pillow, and they did not open again until morning. We'll read chapter 4 at the end of this lesson to kind of wrap it up. You know, readers, Have you ever set out to solve a problem and then you found that the problems just kept multiplying? I remember when I was a boy, my parents would always send us to summer camp, me and my brother. And I loved summer camp, and I had lots of great adventures there that I love writing about and I love telling stories about. But I'm going to tell you about one. There was one time where I signed up for an activity called nature, and that was where we did different activities out in the woods or, out on the lake or, just different places out in nature. We had great sand cliffs near us. So this one night we were going to go on a bear hunt, is what we were told by the counselor, our camp counselor. And there had been a bear that was bothering the horses at night, and we were going to go see what the situation was all about. So we were going to go on a bear hunt into the woods. So there were about 15 of us between the ages of, I would say, 7 and maybe 13, 7 and 13 year olds, with these two camp counselors that were taking us into the woods. So as we got into the woods, the first thing they realized is that they didn't really know which way to go. And they were like, well, we don't know what to do. So that was kind of problem number one is, well, how do we track a bear? And as we continued through the woods, they would note to us, the kids, different ways that we would know that we're on the right track. Things like they would see broken trees, little, saplings that had been snapped, or they would show us, claw marks down the side of a tree, or they would show us some bear poop that was in the brush. So we start walking through the woods and we're following these, we're tracking this bear and we're feeling very brave. And all of a sudden, one of the counselors says, "Do you hear that?" The counselor at the lead of our group, our single file line of children. And he runs off into the woods. Okay. And so now we're like, problem number two, wait, one of the counselors is leaving us here. We've got the other counselor at the back of the trail, at the back of the line, but now one counselor is gone. He's run off into the woods after this bear, we think. The next thing we know, we hear gunshots because the counselor had brought one of the rifle range rifles, these little 22 caliber, for shooting targets. They had brought one with. So we heard the gunshots and then we heard screaming and we're like, oh my gosh. And we all take off running, okay? Because we're panicking. We're thinking he's shooting the bear. The bear is maybe attacking him. We don't know. And we take off running. So then we run and run and run and run and we eventually exit the forest at some other trail, and we end up in this field, this open field. And we're walking through the field, and now we're kind of getting scared and upset. The other counselor is saying, "Oh, don't worry, it's fine, it's fine." And he says, "I'm gonna go. I'm gonna make sure he's okay. Just stay here." So then the other counselor leaves us. So now we're this group of 15 kids in the middle of this field on a bear hunt. And it's not feeling at this point very adventurous. It's actually starting to get a little bit scary. I think I was about 10 years old, so maybe third or fourth grade at this point. So we're alone now, and now we've got that problem. We have no, counselors with us, no adults, so to speak. I think the counselors were actually in their late teens, early 20s, maybe. And we're standing in the field, and we're like, okay, now what? We'll just wait. And all of a sudden, the counselor that had left comes running out of the field, and I'm going to tell you, shirt is ripped up. He's got a t-shirt on, and it's all ripped, and he's got like blood stains all over it. I mean, it was like something out of a scary horror movie in the woods. And we all freak out. He runs up and he opens up his mouth and spits all this blood out, and then just falls down in the field. Now we are in shock. So what do? We take off running because we're like, oh my God, he clearly got attacked by the bear. And we run to the road. Okay, now this is in upper Wisconsin, so it's northern Wisconsin, and it's in the middle of nowhere. And we're on this road, and we said we got to head back to the camp. We've got to get help. We've got to get adults. So there's the 15 of us. Now we're frightened and alone and on the road. And what happens next? It starts to rain. I mean, it literally, a storm blows over and it's pouring rain. And now we're drenched and we're scared and we're trying to get back to camp. And it's an example of, I share this story because it's an example of how one situation just kind of escalates into another. And before you know it, we've got all these problems that we're dealing with. We eventually made it back to camp, and two of the older boys in our group ran into the director's office and said, oh, this had happened. Well, apparently, when he ran into the director's office, the two counselors were both there. They had returned back to camp and were speaking with the director about this situation, I guess. As it turns out, it was all a very elaborate practical joke on a group of kids. Yeah, and it wasn't very funny. The two counselors did get in a lot of trouble, I heard, and I think they were suspended for a week or something because, they had left a group of kids out in the middle of nowhere. Um, but it reminds me a lot of some of the stories that we read. When we read novels, how, I want to teach you that when you are tackling a more complicated book, you're going to find that you run into multiple problems and multiple plot lines, even that are going different directions. So, what's always useful is if you design some sort of chart or even a timeline or some sort of graphic organizer that will help you keep track of the problems and the plot lines. And you're going to use that to gather information just like a scientist would almost in a chart or in a table. But you're going to gather that information to help you keep yourself kind of organized as you work your way through a novel. So I'm going to share my screen with you for a second, and I'm going to show you one example of this that you can use, okay? So let me move me out of the way here. This is an example of a chart. So what I'm going to ask you to do is ask your teachers to pause the video here, and what you can do is you can kind of recreate this chart in your reader's notebook. Okay, so pause the video and then I'm going to talk a little bit about this. So this chart, if you now have it in your reader's notebook, is going to help you track problems and solutions and changes as you read your fantasy book club stories. Now, you'll see there's different categories here, and this is just one example. If you have another way that you want to do this with the books that you're reading, you can do that. Design your own chart. But what I would do is, for example, if I was going to go here, and let's say I'm thinking of, let's think of the book we're reading, the Thief of Always, and I'm going to put Harvey Swick here because he's our main character, and I'm going to now go here and say, what's his problem? Well, we know as the novel started, his problem was he was really bored because it was February, and February is definitely not his favorite month. He's waiting for spring break. He's already come out of Christmas, which was wonderful, and his winter break, and that was his problem, as the novel started. The solution or the change would be he's been invited by this character named Rictus to come to the holiday house where we don't know what's going to happen next. But right now, the solution or the change in that plot is that he's now at the holiday house. We do not know how that's going to play out for him in the end, but we'll have to wait and see. Now, we can add other characters here. We could add Mrs. Griffin because we've met her. We could add Rictus because we met him. We can add, what was the little boy's name? I think it's Wendell. We can add him, and we can add Lulu because those are the characters that we just met. And we can talk as we can write as we read through the novel the different problems they face and how they are dealt with, okay? So this is one example of a tracking the problems and the multiple plot lines in a novel that will really help you keep yourself organized, okay? I'm going to show you just a quick summary of our lesson today. We've been talking about fantasy novels, and we are going to be sophisticated readers of fantasy. We are going to do the following things as we read. Number one, we've talked about researching the setting where the stories take place. We've talked about asking about who has the power, who has it, what's the evidence of it, what kind of power, why do those characters have it, okay? Think about this as you read your novel, as you listen to The Thief of Always, and as you listen to your read-alouds, okay? And talk about these things with your fantasy book club team. We said we're going to learn alongside the main character as they learn new information. How are they learning it? Why is it important? And today we talked about we're going to have to keep track of multiple problems because characters that are in these stories will be dealing with multiple issues. Okay? So finally, I'm going to wrap it up by saying tonight, if you haven't done this already, I want you to jot down in your notebook some kind of chart or some sort of tool that's going to help you analyze some of the problems that you come upon in your stories. You might make a table, for instance, or a list. And then I want you to do some ranking of these problems, okay? I want you to put numbers next to them or stars or things that you think are the most important. And then I want you to write a sentence or two about why that problem is most important. Is it important to the characters? Is it important to the plot? Is it important to the theme? Okay, your chart doesn't have to be fancy. It can be just like you can use the one I posted and showed you. The goal is for you to develop your thinking. Okay, so that's what I want you to do tonight. And we're going to now continue with our read aloud. I'm going to read one more chapter of The Thief of Always, okay, to kind of wrap it up. Here we go. This is chapter 4, and it's called A Death Between Seasons. And this is the image. Where is it? There it is. You can see kind of an animal skull there. It looks like in a garden or something. The sun came to wake him soon after dawn. A straight white dart of light laid on his lids. He sat up with a start, wondering for a moment what bed this was, what room, what house. Then his memories of the previous day returned, and he realized that he'd slept through from late afternoon to early morning. The rest had strengthened him. He felt energetic, and with a whoop of pleasure, he jumped out of bed and got dressed. The house was more welcoming than ever today. The flowers Mrs. Griffin had set on every table, and still singing with color. The front door stood open, and sliding down the gleaming banisters, Harvey raced out onto the porch to inspect the morning. A surprise awaited him. The trees, which had been heavy with leaves the previous afternoon, had shed their canopies. There was new, tiny buds on every branch and twig, as though this were the first day of spring. "Another day, another dollar," said Wendell, ambling around the corner of the house. "What does that mean?" said Harvey. "It's what my father used to say all the time. Another day, another dollar." He's a banker. My dad, Wendell Hamilton the second. And me? I'm Wendell Hamilton the third. How'd you know? Lucky guess. I'm Harvey. Yeah, I know. Do you like tree houses? I never had one. Wendell pointed up at the tallest tree. There was a platform perched among the branches with a rudimentary house built upon it. "I've been working up there for weeks," said Wendell, "but I can't get it finished alone. You want to help me?" "Sure, but I've got to eat something first." "Go eat. I'll be around." Harvey headed back inside and found Mrs. Griffin setting out a breakfast fit for a prince. There was milk spilt on the floor and a cat with a tail hooked like a question mark, lapping it up. "Clue Cat?" he said. "Yes, indeed," Mrs. Griffin said fondly. "He's the wicked one." Clue Cat looked up as if he knew he was being talked about. Then he jumped up onto the table and searched among the plates of pancakes and waffles for something more to eat. "Can he do whatever he likes?" Harvey said, watching the cat sniff at this and that. "I mean, does nobody control him?" Well, we all have somebody watching over us, don't we?" Mrs. Griffin replied, "whether we like it or not. Now eat. You've got some wonderful times ahead of you." Harvey didn't need a second invitation for that. He dug into his second meal at the holiday house with even more appetite than he had the first, and then headed out to meet the day. Oh, what a day it was! The breeze was warm and smelled of the green scent of growing things. The perfect sky was full of swooping birds. He sauntered through the grass, his hands in his pockets, like the lord of all he surveyed, calling to Wendell as he approached the tree. "Can I come up?" "If you've got a head for heights," Wendell dared him. The ladder creaked as he climbed, but he made the platform without missing a step. Wendell was impressed. "Not bad for a new boy," he said. "We had two kids here who couldn't even get halfway up." "Where'd they go?" "Back home, I suppose." Kids come and go, you know. Harvey peered out through the branches, upon which every bud was bursting. You can't see much, can you? He said. I mean, there's no sign of the town at all. Who cares? Says Wendell. It's just gray out there anyway. Well, and it's sunny here, Harvey said, staring down at the wall of misty stones that divided the grounds of the house from the outside world. How's that possible? Wendell's answer was the same again. Who cares? He said. I know I don't. Now, are we going to start building or what? They spent the next 2 hours working on the treehouse, descending a dozen times to dig through the timbers heaped beside the orchard, looking for boards to finish their repairs. By noon, they'd not only found enough wood to fix the roof, but they had each found a friend. Harvey liked Wendell's bad jokes and that "who cares," which found its way into every other sentence. And Wendell seemed just as happy to have Harvey's company. You're the first kid who's been real fun, he said. What about Lulu? What about her? Well, isn't she any fun? She was okay when I first arrived, Wendell admitted. I mean, she's been here months, so she kind of showed me the place. But she's gotten weird the last few days. I see her sometimes wandering around like she's sleepwalking, with a blank expression on her face. She's probably going crazy, Harvey said. Her brain's turned into mush. Do you know about that stuff? Wendell wanted to know, his face lighting up with ghoulish delight. Sure I do, Harvey lied. My dad's a surgeon. Wendell was most impressed by this, and for the next few minutes listened in gaping envy as Harvey told him all about the operations he'd seen. Skulls sawn open and legs sawn off, feet sewn on where hands used to be, and a man with a boil on his behind that grew into a talking head. You swear, said Wendell. I swear, said Harvey. That's so cool. All this talk brought on a fierce hunger, and at Wendell's suggestion, they climbed down the ladder and wandered into the house to eat. What do you want to do this afternoon? He asked Harvey as they sat down at the table. It's going to be real hot. It always is. Is there anywhere we can swim? Wendell frowned. Well, yes, he said doubtfully. There's a lake around the other side of the house, but you won't like it much. Why not? The water's so deep you can't even see the bottom. Are there any fish? Oh, sure. Maybe we could catch some. Mrs. Griffin could cook 'em for us. At this, Mrs. Griffin, who was at the stove piling up a plate with onion rings, gave a little shout and dropped the plate. She turned to Harvey, her face ashen. You don't want to do that, she said. Why not? Harvey replied. I thought I could do whatever I wanted. Well, yes, of course you can, she told him, but I wouldn't want you to get sick. The fish are poisonous, you see? Oh, said Harvey. Well, maybe we won't eat 'em after all. Look at this mess, Mrs. Griffin said, fussing to cover her confusion. I need a new apron. She hurried away to fetch one, leaving Harvey and Wendell to exchange puzzled looks. Now I really have to see those fish, Harvey said. As he spoke, the ever-inquisitive Clue Cat jumped up onto the counter beside the stove, and before either of the boys could move to stop him, he had his paws up on the lip of one of the pans. Hey, get down, Harvey told him. The cat didn't dare take orders. He hoisted himself onto the rim of the pan to sniff at its contents, its tail flicking back and forth. The next moment, disaster. The tail danced too close to one of the burners and burst into flames. Clue Cat yowled and tipped over the pan that he was perched upon. A wave of boiling water washed off the top of the stove, and he fell to the ground in a smoking heap. Whether drowned, scalded, or incinerated, the end was the same. He hit the floor, dead. The din brought Mrs. Griffin hurrying back. I think I'm going to go eat outside, Wendell said as the old woman appeared at the door. He snatched up a couple of hot dogs and was gone. Oh, my lord, Mrs. Griffin cried when she set her eyes on the dead cat. Oh, you foolish thing. It was an accident, Harvey said, sickened by what had just happened. He was up on the stove. Foolish thing, was all Mrs. Griffin seemed to be able to say. She sank down onto her knees and stared at the sad little sack of burned fur. No more questions from you, she finally murmured. The sight of Mrs. Griffin's unhappiness made Harvey's eyes sting, but he hated to have anyone see him cry, so he fought back his tears as best he could, and he said, Shall I help you bury him? in his gruffest voice. Mrs. Griffin looked around. "That's very sweet of you," she said softly, "but there's no need. You go out and play. I don't want to leave you on your own," Harvey said. "Oh, look at you, child," Mrs. Griffin said. "You've got tears on your cheeks." Harvey blushed and wiped them away with the back of his hand. "Don't be ashamed to weep," Mrs. Griffin said. "It's a wonderful thing. I wish I could still shed a tear or two." "Well, you're sad," Harvey said. "I can see that." "What I feel is not quite sadness," Mrs. Griffin replied, "and it's not much solace either, I'm afraid." "What's solace?" Harvey asked. It's something soothing," Mrs. Griffin said, getting to her feet. "Something that heals the pain in your heart. And you don't have any of that?" "No, I don't," Mrs. Griffin said. She reached out and touched Harvey's cheek. "Except maybe in these tears of yours. They comfort me." She sighed as she traced their tracks with her fingers. "Your tears are sweet, child, and so are you. Now go out into that light and enjoy yourself. There's sun on the step, and it won't be there forever. Believe me." Are you sure?" "I'm sure." I'll see you later then," Harvey said, and headed out into the afternoon. And with that, we're going to wrap up today's Reader's Workshop, and off you go.